So in terms of a full bio of the panelists, for the sake of time, I'll just introduce them in the order that they will be presenting with their affiliations. But by all means, take advantage of Google to appreciate the fabulousness of these people to my right. So the first person that will be presenting will be Ronaldo Anderson, who's an assistant professor of the humanities at Harris Stowe State University. Then it will be Michelle Beverly, an adjunct professor at Georgia State University, who has that newly minted PhD. Glory about her. Then it'll be myself. I'm an assistant professor of film at Ohio University. And then finally, John Jennings, an associate professor of visual studies at SUNY Buffalo. So,
I'd like to thank you all for coming. This project is basically a little over a year-and-a-half project. Started out of a discussion between myself and my friend, colleague, and classmate John Jennings. Led from a presentation that we made in Paris last summer at UNESCO at a conference, and it's still ongoing. Dark futures, Afrofuturism, and Black postmodern aesthetic. I approached this project with an attempt trying to come up with some type of framework for interpreting the present moment. Because in discussions with friends, colleagues, or friends, or just lay people, we thought it didn't make sense to interpret the present movement through, say, civil rights rhetoric, the same way it wouldn't have made sense for people during the Harlem Renaissance to look at that historical movement through abolitionist rhetoric. And then I think the gut emotional part was I got tired of seeing zombie flicks where no black people seem to survive a zombie apocalypse. So I thought it was important to see how we imagine ourselves in the future, writing our own future, a framework for this. So that's kind of all those feelings, emotions, and interactions lead to this project. I think traditionally, based on the 90s, on work other people have done, Afrofuturism starts out related primarily to speculative fiction, technoculture, music, and the literary field, talking about African Americans in relation to technology and an enhanced future. And as David notes, futurist thought causes reconciliation between a disembodied identity to be future and the past, and I think has gone on to expand into some other areas that weren't previously necessarily explored. In conversations I've mentioned, I think, whereas the work that was done by Alondra, Kali Tao, Anna Everett, and others a decade ago, we might call that Afrofuturism 1.0, and I think we're starting to close in on solidifying 2.0, and then maybe some directions for 3.0 after the conference. Up there, there's a picture of a friend, that's an artistic representation of the author, Nettie Okorafor, drawn by John Jennings. She recently won the World Fantasy Award for her science fiction. And I would say in the current state of Afrofuturism is moving beyond this African-American conception of it in terms of embracing post-colonial aspects across the diaspora. You can also take into consideration Rasta futurism and how futurism looks in other black contexts. And so what I have there, I'm thinking of an emerging philosophy for this time and space, or a transition to whatever's next. What I have up there, that math theorem, that's a representation of Boolean algebra that I put up there. When I think of Boolean algebra being how you write digital code, the basis of digital code, so I'm thinking this mathematical representation maybe being an aspect relating to the digital and the visual in terms of forming a basis for putting together a philosophy. Previously, a lot of times, when you're talking about black philosophy of anything, some people have a habit of thinking a lot of black ideas and thought are derivatives of European ones. However, I like Anthony Bowe's work, who talks about a lot of times Black diasporic scholars have to be heretics, where we engage European models of knowledge and then produce our own knowledge based upon our own history and knowledge structures. And so we're looking at this framework where I'm thinking of a way of looking at the visual art in terms of what I call an expanded hermeneutic or an Africana digital hermeneutic in relation to digital reproduction in the technosphere. An interpretation of how reality is perceived, how it's shaped by digital technology, changed our spatiotemporal experience, and how digital code is implemented at the biological and nano level. And I'm arguing that this hermeneutic would operate intersubjectively and intertextually, identifying symbolic systems. That's what we're going to be looking at, symbolic codes, and I'm thinking of having an argument with the work of Jameson and working on this aspect here, and codes influencing the configuration of knowledge and its reproduction. However, there's some pitfalls of railing it as a resistance. Therefore, despite possibilities, these threats pose in relation to the biological, as we talked about at our keynote address yesterday, in relation to genetics, technology, and the future. An assessment has to be put together for the collective survival of the community. And I start with the origin of the problem when we talk about this idea of how color and why is color and blackness presented in certain ways when we're dealing with Eurocentrism. And it talks about where Eurocentrism is based from an annexed Hellenism, that's Greek antiquity culture that removed Greece from its relationship to Northern Africa and the Near East in terms of how modern European sensibilities are constructed. And therefore, when you see these science fiction movies, the only future is a progressive Europeanization or whatever happens. That's why you see Star Trek or whatever, even in a galaxy 50 miles away, it looks like Europe, and not anything else other than that in terms of how it gets reproduced. This is an example of Johann Winkelmann, the fetishizing of whiteness that I labeled as this deals where the European scholars in the 17th and 18th century begin to codify these ideas around color and how race then begins to interact with art. You have Goethe, Camper, Lavatar, where they complete this mythological fetishizing of whiteness in relation to African features based upon these Greco-Roman traits, although Greece at the time was seen as more Turkish because when they were writing this, the Ottoman Empire was controlling Greece. So then we get to the New World, and I like what Toni Morrison has to say about this in the early 90s. She talks about white writers presenting these Africanist figures as alter egos of themselves that need to be contained. And you see this representation of what the Republican Party was portrayed in the 19th century versus the Democratic platform. Forms of future past, how you see these old constructions of the mammy then being implemented in science fiction in terms of how they're dressed, the head wrap, and how their personas are portrayed even in science fiction. So you see this trope that lasts from the 19th century even into science fiction futures. Morrison's idea of the American identity in terms of these speech and language codes that America used to structure itself. For example, the works of Russell Kirk, who wrote about the conservative mind in the 1960s, where he writes saying that the American president should be a 6-foot-tall Anglo male from a small town. So they couldn't find one of those from a small town. So they go to Sarah Palin, but that mythological past is no longer as what Russell Kirk depicts when they talk about this mythological identity that America is supposed to possess. To the left, that was I remember when I first started watching Star Trek with the Lieutenant Uhura, Nichelle Nichols, I believe she had the first interracial kiss in Star Trek, and the way her attire in Star Trek was always pretty suggestive in relation to the rest of the group. This other character to the right is a young lady who is on a show called Misfits. You can pull down from Hulu. I believe her name is Alicia Bailey, and her superpower, I believe, is if you touch her, you have to have the urge to make love to her or have sex with her. That's her superpower. So you can kind of see this kind of trope continuing even in some contemporary sci-fi. This, the idea of the noble savage, one of my favorite characters as a kid I used to read was the Black Panther, and that's why there's a kind of interest in the dynamic at work here, because Jack Kirby introduces the figure of the Black Panther to the mainstream comic world, Jack Kirby being a Jewish American, which then, you know, it paves the way for these other black comic heroes to appear. But the Black Panther character is a gentleman called T'Challa. I probably mispronounced his name. He's from an African kingdom and has these mystical powers from a panther god that enables him to then leave Africa to come fight crime in America. There also, you see how this is portrayed in our politics, where Obama has this relationship. I remember when I saw this magazine when it came out during the inauguration in D.C., and they're selling these things and constructing this interesting relationship between this idea of Obama, superpowers, and geekiness in terms of this construction of blackness in relation to this superpower and superpowers. Now, one of the things where it becomes a problem now in terms of, as I was talking with colleagues recently, there was a time in the history of the black man when you talk about visual arts, in the average black home, you could walk in and see the white Jesus and say one of the Kennedys up there. And so it's like we had to work a generation to get that picture down. And now it's been replaced where you have a picture where you have two gentlemen who died resisting the system, and in the picture with them is a person who manages the system. So that person, one of those people does not belong in that picture, you know. And so this thing of this post-modernity in terms of figuring out political location in relation to identity and visual art, it occupies a kind of nebulous space in terms of how people's history is remembered and how it's explained, and how there can be a penalty to pay when you criticize the aspect of that picture. Okay, and here, the manufacturing of consent. During the inauguration, it was interesting that for the inauguration, they had a civil rights type of motif that is present during the swearing in of Obama, where they get one of the widows of one of the leaders of the movement, Medgar Evers. And I know my stepfather, he was president of the Jackson, Mississippi NAACP, worked with Medgar Evers at the time, and he knew the Evers family well. Gets her to use the tradition of the black prayer, which is traditionally used for salvation or transformation, to bless, you know, to hijack or borrow this intellectual tradition of the civil rights movement to then pray for the success of American policy. And then on the right hand, borrowing King's Bible that he uses for divine inspiration to inspire him to come up with ideas to lead the movement to then bless his presidency. However, what is then revealed when you talk about symbolic reality and logic and digital reproduction, what it hides is the fact that this government endorses a foreign policy of drone attacks and arguing that it is not only moral and ethical and legal, and that contradicts that civil rights tradition that they were talking about during the swearing in, and also obscures the fact that according to some scholars, we now have more black men in prison than there were in slavery in 1850. And I kind of threw this little piece of art in here with that John Jennings put this kind of two-faced aspect of looking at a situation. I would think of the Roman god Janus in terms of everything has two faces in terms of how you look at it. And I thought that's how I interpret the picture, the visual art present. Maybe you have a different one, but I thought that kind of was symbolic of the kind of moment we're in now, looking in these two different directions. Coming to a close here, I think the cultural history and literary tradition and its relationship to technocratic changes that have impacted these communities, I think this Afrofuturistic tradition can interrogate these of this so-called post-racial moment and explore this paradox of visual representation of real black misery, which is obscured by so-called this black success just because we have a black president. It's like we don't have anything to complain about anymore. So this tradition provides a framework for analysis of the current moment with its apocalyptic tragedies of genocide, natural disaster, and plutocratic control of resources necessary for human development and survival. Get that in there, and thank you.
today about something that I think is a very compelling way to sort of look at Black female bodies in relationship to this question of Afrofuturism, and in relationship to ways that we transition, not transcend, but transition from moments of trauma to moments, I think, of great creativity. And so my presentation today is called From Gila to Erica, the Immortal Lives of Black Women in Contemporary Visual Culture. And this image that I have here is not showing any particular direct relationship from any of these circles. But what I think it suggests is that there is a complicated archive that we have overlooked in many respects. An archive that exists at the cellular level, the biological level, and those things, I think, move us forward into creativity that we see in artists like Erykah Badu. And this final image at the bottom, well, at the top is Henrietta Lacks, the woman named, whose name bears the Gila connotation and whose body I'll talk about in some detail today. And then to the right, we have an image from artist Wangechi Mutu. And I'm going to talk about how I think Gila and Mutu do some powerful work and share some some important commonalities. And then at the bottom here, we have an image from the window seat video that I'll show just a clip of today. And that's Erykah Badu's sex-made body. And then we have another image here from the Erykah Badu archive, which I'll talk about. And then the final image is an image of Gila cells. So that's sort of a way of tying together these things that I think have some important commonalities. And I'm going to read quite a bit of this, so hopefully you can stay with me here. I know we're a little full, a little sleepy nails. In his novel, Dreamer, prolific scholar and writer Charles Johnson provides a phenomenological account of the civil rights movement. In one particularly descriptive passage here, which I have for you to read with me, he articulates how the experience of the civil rights movement was in essence a break in the time-space continuum for Black bodies. I quote, "Then from the front room we could hear the door open. Outside, sirens pierced the hot night air. The neighborhood dogs howled. Through the window I saw flames from burning cars dancing against a dark sky, swirling with tear gas and smoke. The night felt wrong. All of it as if the riot, the looting, the lunacy, the breakdown and disorder had torn space and time, destroying some delicate balance or barrier between dimensions, possible worlds, creating a portal for fantastic creatures to pour through." Now in this passage, Johnson describes a rupture that propelled bodies into a paradoxical world of peaceful protest and nonviolent resistance that was met with horrific violence, assassinations, and riots. And for me, this description is not only phenomenologically important, but it also provides a description of a world filled with rituals of profound bodily and spatial disorientation, creating an almost alien subjectivity, a world where what it meant to be human would be forever changed. And part of what is interesting to me about this passage is that the civil rights movement is, in effect, creating this alternative subjectivity, that none of us are the same in that moment. And in this space, sensory, spatial, and body disorientation prevailed for a moment. Yet the same experience produced an alternative sense of social transformation and a reimagination of the self. These bodies and the culture that they would produce bore the marks and the ugliness of trauma, often being regarded as alien, foreign, ugly, and inhuman. But in many cases, these bodies morphed into Johnson's fantastic creatures, claiming the freedom to release a creativity and an intelligence that had previously been repressed, denied, or misinterpreted. These bodies were not merely traumatized, but also animated, becoming forces of cultural transformation, social agency, and self-possession. This is in many ways the story of the experiences of slavery, abuse, gender and sexual violation, as these bodies navigate past and present experiences of psychic and physical trauma. This excerpt from Dreamer provides language and a vivid metaphysical scene, pinpointing a seminal moment in the creation of an otherworldly experience for Black bodies, moving through history, time, space, discourse, and matter. Now today, given our investment here at this conference in this notion of alien bodies and our particular panel's inquiry into the relationship between historiography, art aesthetics, and embodiment, I've chosen to discuss a particular trajectory of my research that examines the possibilities of visual culture in the context of Black female bodies and artistry within what I'm calling two specific portals. The first portal that I describe explores the impact of HeLa cells as images at the intersection of cellular and artistic possibilities. I juxtapose a reading of HeLa cells with the work of artist Wangechi Mutu, who creates vivid embodied collages of cells, skin, tissues, and deceased flesh. And all of these things create a strikingly visual template. Through a second portal, I'll discuss the work of Afrofuturist artist and scholar Patrice Gaskins. And we have the privilege of having Patrice here, so she's going to get to see me talk about her work. Patrice, can you just wave? There she is. And musical performer and visual icon Erykah Badu. Gaskins' work imagines a reading of the past and future, where both spheres are inflected with sensate experience and limitless ingenuity. Her creation of otherworldly experiences also emerges in her second life installation entitled My Steampunk Dream, which I'll show just a clip of. And I describe that as a post-Black cyber narrative. Erykah Badu, an artist whose musical style includes neo-soul, blues, hip-hop, R&B, and many other influences, uses her own body as a template onto which she writes her own conception of history and human possibilities. I'm going to begin talking about HeLa cells, and it's very difficult for all of us scholars, I think, to condense our work into these small places. So I could talk to you about HeLa cells all day. I think that it's a really profound metaphor for not just the Black experience as we've come to understand it, which we use that term, right? And some of us are resistant to it, but she in some ways embodies so many of those things that we have called the Black experience. But I'm seeing her in a very different light today, and I want to talk about her in that way. I want to first talk about this cover here. The Mortal Life of Henrietta Lacks. If you've not read the book, I certainly recommend it. Many of us have. I think it's a book that's been circulated in a really profound way. I mean, I know young people who are reading it, and I think it's a very important book because it raises so many questions about the ethics of biomedicine and all of those things, but it also tells a very personal narrative, and I think the author does a beautiful job of integrating those things. In her award-winning book, Rebecca Skloot unearths the story of Henrietta Lacks. And Lacks was a woman who migrated from Virginia to live in an industrial neighborhood in South Baltimore. And after giving birth to her 5th child, she realized that she had cervical cancer. And the description of the cancer in the book is one of the most profound things I've ever read. She talks about how she could actually feel it, and not just touch it. She could touch it. It was on her cervix, but she could also feel it growing inside her. And they describe in the book how when she was in the throes of dying from this cancer, the pain was so intense that they pumped morphine into her veins, and it did nothing. And this is in the 1950s when morphine was morphine. I mean, it was really intense. And even with all of the treatments they tried to give her, she suffered tremendously with this particular cancer. She's seeking treatment at Johns Hopkins, and what happens is pretty profound. Without her consent, some cells are extracted from the tumor, and these cells become the first cells to live outside of the human body. And this is something that scientists have been trying to do for many, many years. But the impact of the cells really cannot be understated, as Skloot in the book explains. I quote, cells from her servants living on forever, bought, sold, packaged, and shipped by the trillions to laboratories around the world. I try to imagine how she'd feel, knowing that her cells went up in the first space missions to see what would happen to human cells in zero gravity, or that they helped with some of the most important advances in medicine, the polio vaccine, chemotherapy, cloning, gene editing, and so on. With this discovery, doctors and scientists at Johns Hopkins began to revolutionize the study and treatment of human disease. But what's most important in the book, I think, is that Skloot provides a gripping account of the impact of Henrietta Lacks's life and death and how her cellular immortality not only impacted how we treat disease, but her own family. So I'm going to fast forward a bit here. I want to show you some images of Gila slides. And we are sort of trained to read these images as scientific or medical. But I'm sort of trying to undo that and see them in a way that is not just artistic, but in a way that expands their possibilities. There are millions of HeLa cells frozen around the world, yet each one seems like a fingerprint distinctive, with its own story to tell of what it might heal, create, or destroy. The HeLa cells provide a contrast to the distorted reading of the black female body as an overdetermination of skin color and flesh, as they, along with the work of contemporary artist Wangechi Mutu, displace corporeal blackness and fleshiness as pillars of a visual identity for black female bodies. And now I'm going to show you a Mutu image here that I think is a really compelling parallel to the HeLa cells. And again, we could spend so much time, I think, really talking about this image. And what is most profound about her work, at least this particular piece, is that not only is the cancer itself, the black mass, externalized, but it calls to mind the social trauma and dysfunction that those things create. This piece is part of a Mutu exhibit called Histology of the Different Classes of Uterine Tumors, where beauty and disease are mapped onto bodies, faces, organs, and tissues. And in this image, the female reproductive system is, as I said, partially obscured under this black mass. There's so much more I could say, but I want to make sure I get to some other parts of my presentation. But together, I think these two images move us beyond conventional historical and scientific record to a space where the body reveals, tells, heals, and knows. Subjectivity is also redefined in the work of Nutrice Gaskins. And she has a number of digital portraits, which she, interestingly, in this series, does a black and white version and then a color version. And I use her work to define this portal where the body is moving through trauma, because if you'll notice, especially in the black and white, you can really see expressions of sort of a trauma, a transformation, a process that's emerging, and yet there's a strong strand of optimism or sort of connection to something beyond that trauma, beyond this sort of indescribable experience that these bodies are going through. And so there's this sense of a visual portal that you're traveling through, and there's also a sense of an embodiment of the present. So there's this interesting dichotomy between sort of not only past and present, but inhabiting the very moment that we're in. And these are some of her images, which I would love to talk more about, but I just wanted you to at least get a chance to see them. And now I want to move to a short clip of her installation here. Just a bit of it. But it's really fantastic. It's this wonderful collage of art and sound, and there's a really a critique of the plantation system that's embedded in another video. So it's just these layers of experience and time and space is all sort of collapsed in this one piece here. All right, I've been told I have 1 minute and I must move so rapidly that it's not fair, but all right. Erykah Badu. We've been talking about Erykah Badu, and I keep coming in on these great Erykah Badu conversations. I want to just, she's an archive unto herself, and I think worthy of extreme attention. I want to just quickly, I guess, talk about how I see Window Seat. Let's not show it. Let me just sort of offer a little bit of analysis of it. If you have not seen it, it is a video where she is in Dealey Plaza and essentially strips her clothes off and is naked, and then assassinated at the end. And I think this is a very important moment to sort of reconcile time and space in history. Very quickly. Badu's video for the song Window Seat is an explicit articulation of how bodies might reclaim history in space. The video created a stir as she walks through Dealey Plaza, the iconic scene of Kennedy's assassination, taking off clothes while there are passersby who are literally seeing her do this in a moment. And what is most important to me is that she's reclaiming a space that we might not think that a black woman, even a black woman from Dallas, should be in. And she is not only reclaiming that space and giving it her own sense of what history is, what being a woman means, but she's sort of rewriting this idea of what it is to be assassinated. And she doesn't go to the Lorraine Motel or the Audubon Ballroom or some other site of black assassination, but she reclaims this space and writes it with her own conception of history. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is it. Thank you.
Okay, so what I'm going to be presenting now is kind of a sketch of the last chapter from my book manuscript that I'm in the process of psyching myself up to start. So what I'm interested in particularly is to think about the work of Barry Jenkins, most immediately his feature film, the 2008 feature film Medicine for Melancholy, and his 2011 short Green Migration. So bear with me as I kind of map all of this out, give you a sketch of my interest. So to begin, I'll begin with a quote from Onqui and Wazer. Quote, "Using a black subject in a work of art is neither a casual act nor innocent. To confer upon the black figure an aesthetic and historical value in artistic production is a consciously political act, one that does not in any way diminish the aesthetic value of the intention." End quote. And Wazer's cycling observation on blackness and value in terms of craft, history, and praxis most immediately informs my thoughts today about the work of Barry Jenkins, and in particular, Medicine for Melancholy. I appreciate in Wazer's comment as a call to reanimate the terms of our critical pleasure with regards to blackness and the arts. In this way, I'm attempting to navigate the rich multiplicity of blackness as always already in historiographic craft and visual practice, visual praxis, and this is what continues to guide me. I'm interested in the narrativity and consequence of enactments of what I term as film blackness, for I insist on conceptualizing the idea of black film as a distinct figuration of black visual and expressive culture. And I often do so with a willingness to be at peace with ambiguity. In this way, I consider the way that Medicine for Melancholy stages ideas of love and attachment that are mediated by tension surrounding blackness, historical consciousness, and space. The film's narrative follows a black man and black woman who couple for a day after a one-night stand. I think I will just let this play while we talk. The film navigates the cultural history and geography of San Francisco with an inflection of melancholic longing that disputes the utopian language of the city as site of cosmopolitan progress. In this way, part of what the film does is narrativize the demographic impacts and textures of the Bay Area. It employs significantly a muted abstraction of color that evokes mellowed watercolors that I read in terms of the indeterminacy of memory and, moreover, a trace of ghosting. Maybe you'll play me good. Anyway, and this is kind of done through this use of post-production desaturation of the image. And in this way, you end up with a very significant kind of phasing palette, where at times the image takes on a degree of a sepia tone, but most immediately the shots end up creating a tableau that I think of in terms of the portraiture of blues people. In this way, between the shifting of oversaturation and desaturation, the film takes on a significant look of a weathered photography, which is of course spotted occasionally with this appearance of the primary colors, which act as significant punctums. So in this way, I consider Medicine for Melancholy as a kind of act of affective mapping. And the sense of affective mapping that I'm working with comes from Jonathan Flatley's work. Particularly the way that Jonathan Flatley argues, quote, "We develop our sense of our environments through activity in the world, and we always bring with us a range of intentions, beliefs, desires, moods, and affective attachments to this activity. Hence, our spatial environments are inevitably imbued with the feelings we have about the places we are going, the things that happen to us along the way, the people we meet in these emotional valiances, which of course affect how we create itineraries." The particular itinerary of the film with regards to its narrative involves, as I said, a 24-hour coupling after a one-night stand between a man and a woman. The man's name is Mika, a black man who as he identifies, born and raised in San Francisco, and Joe, who is a self-identified transplant, who is a self-employed designer of T-shirts that are homages to pioneering women, or pioneering women directors of early cinema. In this instance of their post-hookup at the party, they end up spending the day tracing, in a sense, a strange erasure of history that's occurring on an everyday level within San Francisco. What I'm interested in is the way that Mika's insistence on this kind of romantic coupling with Joe is mediated by a native son's melancholy. He is a watcher of the shifting cultural landscape of San Francisco, one who remembers when it was working class and artists of colors and artists of shades of black, brown, and white. In this way, Mika's desire is compelled by an attachment to the city, and that attachment becomes transferred to Joe and what he wants to believe as being potentially love. Now, one of the things that I do in what I'm kind of drafting is looking the way in which there are these kind of specific scenes of instruction that happen between Mika and Joe. How many people have seen the film, Medicine for Melancholy? So, of course, the first kind of major scene of instruction that occurs is this issue over why is Black History Month in February. Then we end up having this, the clip, which isn't playing, but I'll explain it to you later on. We also have this scene of instruction around where Mika teaches Joe the importance of understanding sampling. We then have this conversation about the dwindling population at this point when the film came out, it was, Mika claims that the African American population of San Francisco is 7%. Strangely, a year later, now that population is being measured at 6.1%. So I'm interested in how this idea of this sense of black radiance, of this ways in which black love will save them, will in some ways save this slowly disappearing history of San Francisco, is a false promise. In one scene in particular, Mika has a poster hanging on his wall, which is from the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency, entitled Residential Rehabilitation Survey, Western Addition Area 2, July 1962. It's an interesting document because it essentially becomes the model for the way in which there is this massive collusion between the private sector and the local government to, in a sense, position San Francisco as being the capital of the newly emergent Pacific Rim. So what we have in this kind of post-war positioning of San Francisco is a sense of the ways in which the urban spaces of San Francisco, much in the way of what Robert Moses does in New York, is this kind of issue of urban design with regards to problem solving. In other words, the city is a problem that needs to be solved. And the solving of this problem requires the massive expulsion, or the tacit expulsion of black and brown communities. Now the scene that's not playing, that I will explain, to me is kind of a pivotal shifting moment in the film. It's where Joe has suggested that, why don't we go to MoMA for the day? And Joe wants to go to MoMA, and Mika says, that becomes this conversation about what do black people not do on a Sunday? Go to a museum. And Mika convinces her instead to go to MOAD, the Museum of the African Diaspora. So the scene, if it was playing, you'd hear him say, MOAD, Mama, not MoMA. And as they enter into MOAD, how many people have been to MOAD? Okay. So the exterior of MOAD is this really incredible collage made up of thousands of photographs of all shades of brown. That's kind of modeled on a Chester Higgins photograph of a Ghanaian woman, of a Ghanaian girl from the 1970s. They enter within MOAD, they go upstairs, they experience some of the interactive exhibits that are there, and then they enter this kind of listening space. Thanks. So within this listening space, they then sit down, and ironically enough, the text which they're listening to is the writings of Oladu Equiano. And it's particularly the section where he's talking about his first experiences of boarding the slave ship. From that moment, they end up exiting MOAD and walk down the street and enter Yerba Buena Park. And it's within Yerba Buena Park that they come upon the Martin Luther King Memorial Waterfall. And there, etched within this structure, is the quote, is the King quote, "I believe that a day will come when all God's children, from base black to treble white, will be significant on the Constitution's keyboard." So we move from the middle passage to this the civil rights gesture. And what's interesting to me is right after this moment when they leave the King Memorial, after we already have this visual cue with the expectation of the sound of a keyboard, is we start hearing the plucking of strings. And for me, one of the things that I argue about this sequence is that this is the moment where the film gestures most explicitly to the source piece for Medicine for Melancholy, which is Claire Denis' film, Friday Night. It actually employs the score, which is written by Dickon Highcliffe, and the song is Lo Rale. Lo Rale, and has anyone seen Friday Night by Claire Denis? Okay. What's significant about Claire Denis' Friday Night is that it begins with this kind of traffic jam the random coupling between these two people, which leads to kind of a rather accelerated romance, which lasts over the course of the evening. But what I'm doing in terms of my reading of how Claire Denis' film inspires Medicine for Melancholy and its accelerated sense of coupling is some of what Elena Del Rio explores in terms of the speed and the performance of movement that occurs in Claire Denis' film, which for me, for the purposes of Medicine for Melancholy, becomes a part of the film's constitutive affect of escape velocity. Escape velocity in the sense of this ever erasure of history, but also importantly with the desperation and the kind of panic with which Mika pursues Joe. So in conclusion of these kind of points about Medicine for Melancholy, why doesn't this love work? Why can't this be this kind of promise of a Love Jones for the new millennium? Yeah! And it can't be, and it won't be. And the reason why it won't be has a great deal to do with that this isn't really about love, that this is more about this desperation of attachment, which in many ways is the more I watch this film, the less sympathetic I become to Mika and actually become more interested in Joe. That's not to say that I don't appreciate what Mika is going through, but there's also kind of a sad bastard Jack and Jill survivor quality to him that I grow ever unsympathetic towards. Now, I'm running out of time, so I just want to quickly kind of leave that on pause and jump to remigration to at least give you a sense of what remigration is about and how I bridge it from Medicine for Melancholy. Remigration is a 2011 short by Barry Jenkins, and if you're not familiar with the Future State series, it is a series that is established through the independent television service where they solicit, each season is made up of 11 digital shorts to basically get filmmakers to, in a sense, make these kind of speculative pieces about what the future of America will be 5, 15, 25 years down the line. Now, any time for me that I hear these kind of premises of speculations of the future, it always already for me is engaged with this issue of you unlock the door with the key of imagination. Beyond it is another dimension, a dimension of sight, a dimension of sound, a dimension of mind. You're traveling through a land of both shadow and substance, of things and ideas. You've just crossed over into the twilight zone. From 1959 to 1964, 156 episodes, 92 of which written by the creator himself, Rod Serling. Now, one of the things that I find that's interesting about this kind of speculation, this speculative act of remigration, is how much it is invested in the sense of the biopolitical ploy. Essentially, what has happened with San Francisco is that San Francisco no longer has a working class. San Francisco in the future is strictly the haven for the 1%. So, the film opens with the arrival of officials from the San Francisco Redevelopment Agency. They have arrived with basically offering this couple the opportunity to return to San Francisco to strictly work as laborers for the sake that their child will be able to receive a full education and also, importantly, in a non-Toni Braxton sense, that she might be able to breathe again because she's a severe asthmatic. So this becomes this really interesting quandary of these locals who have been, in a sense, who are living in a rural area outside of San Francisco, who have the opportunity to come back to strictly be labor, okay, and to consent to that kind of premise. And I'm out of time, but essentially, between bridging between Medicine for Melancholy and his later film of Remigration, I'm interested in this sense of when black love becomes black attachment and becomes more of a sense of cruel optimism with the way that we think about black futurity. Thank you.
I'm a black person, so I'll take a second to I feel like they'll be the Wizard of Oz and see all the stuff. In Search of the Mother Box Connection, and it is a collaborative piece with my friend and colleague Stacey Robinson, who is also a visual artist. Oh yeah, by the way, I'm a visual artist, make stuff. And I talk about the stuff that I make, and I talk about visual culture. And am I doing this right? I hope so. So I'm trying to just get these things open. I'm sorry. Am I copying? I don't know what I'm doing. Sorry. Because basically I have like separate JPEGs. I think I just need to copy it.
Why don't you talk and I'll just click?
Yeah, because basically what I want to do is actually just talk while these particular images are just kind of going. Because
There's a
Yeah.
slideshow feature.
Right now,
There's
it's a slideshow feature. Yeah.
Okay, all right.
So basically, just to kind of contextualize things, this work that you're seeing is the alien body in question is BlackMaybe, which is a body of work, about 85 pieces of work that were inspired by this. And I'll talk more about this legal decision against Jack Kirby's family, his surviving family. Jack Kirby, anybody familiar with Jack Kirby's work? Okay, so Jack Kirby is kind of like the silent partner of Stan Lee, the co-creator of pretty much everything in the Marvel Universe that's making a lot of money right now. So basically Disney, who now owns Marvel, basically Disney, who now owns Marvel Comics, decided against remuneration for his creations. And so basically, like the Avengers, for instance, which is one of his co-created pieces, made almost $2 billion. And so when we started thinking about this connection between like how some of the Jewish creators, like Jack Kirby and Stan Lee, kind of created some of the conventions in American comics, we started thinking about this notion of disenfranchisement, but also the comic space or the space of resistance as well. So I'm just going to read some of this piece. I'm working on this kind of like a methodological kind of narrative about like how we thought about Afrofuturism and its connection to this project. All right. So it is my belief, I'm going to go pretty quickly because I know we're short on time. It is my belief that Afrofuturism is a lens that renders reality via a pan-technological perspective. I feel that it views everything as a type of technology. And Afrofuturism, in my opinion, embraces the artifice as it fully exploits the fact that all things that we think define us are merely constructions that function as prosthetics that produce various effects relating to their users' needs. Throughout history, black people, particularly oppressed black people, have instantly noticed the affordances of various types of technology while under various modes of control. The most important affordances of these liberation technologies have always been freedom, equity, and agency. Whether it's been literacy, civil rights, social justice, or simply access to an internet connection, black people see the systems that they have been denied access to and have used various means to circumvent these obstacles that prevent that access. When someone is forced to be outside a system, a particular given system, it's much easier for that person to see all of that system in its entirety from that observational standpoint. It's also easy to see possible weaknesses from that vantage point as well. Technology, where there is access to it, can sometimes equalize. Technology it also has the potential to level the playing field and render everything equitable. It has the power to destroy and subjugate, as history has shown as well. However, it's also important to realize that that if everything is technologically framed, then everything can be hacked into and rewritten. Afrofuturism actively customizes the products it encounters and makes them fit the needs of its users. This ideology is one of the methodologies that aids in establishing Afrofuturism as such a radical mode of critical production and cultural production and criticism. And this mode of thinking regarding Afrofuturism was highly inspired by John Okonkwo's short film on Afrofuturism called The Last Angel of History. In the introduction to the film, John Okonkwo narrates the story of the legendary bluesman Robert Johnson's Faustian deal with the devil at a Mississippi crossroads. In return for his soul, Johnson is given what Okonkwo calls a black technology. This technology is the blues. This technology then spawns all of these other technologies relating to cultural production by black people in the West. And Okonkwo goes on to create his heroic narrative in the form of the data thief, an intergalactic time-traveling hacker who is excavating in the crossroads in order to find pieces of black history to assemble what he designates as a quote-unquote code. He then states that if the code is quote-unquote broken and hacked into by the thief, then
then have access to keep their own future. A single clue is given to the data thief, and that clue in the guise of a word is called the mothership connection. It is the data thief's duty to steal back the past taken from him and his people, and by finding the necessary artifacts to restore the connection to a collective construct of a shared history. After viewing this film and digesting the information presented, I came to the conclusion that this connection was pretty obvious when actually we exist in the present. However, the present is always a link to the past and the future. And we take this link for granted due to our perceptions. We have been socialized to a certain degree to think of ourselves and our lives as being disconnected. This couldn't be further from the truth. As Black people in America, our histories have been hacked into by enslavement, discrimination, sometimes violence, and basically this particular social disruption inadvertently created an opportunity and a community. So Afrofuturism, in a certain sense, can be seen as a trick. It uses wordplay in a very clever fashion to hide its true intent. It isn't necessarily always focused on looking forward, or at least not in the way that futurists of the West looked forward as looking forward via technology. Afrofuturism sometimes looks backwards towards the future, which, like the West African guy at the crossroads, Eshu looks at the future and past as one. The same Eshu, like the Greeks' martyr savior Prometheus, steals the knowledge and enlightenment from the gods themselves. Eshu, however, doesn't steal fire as Prometheus does. The trickster and data thief steals the very act of divination, the ability to see the future and how all life relates to it. So Afrofuturists, in my opinion, are very concerned with excavating the past and how all life relates to it. Afrofuturists are very concerned with excavating the past, reclaiming it, and then rewriting it. If the data thief is a time traveler, then he or she understands that by altering history, you can alter the future. In my own excavations for the truth, I was introduced to a text by French art theorist Nicolas Bourriaud called Post-Production. In his introduction to the concept of post-production, Bourriaud states that post-production is a technical term for an audiovisual vocabulary used in television, film, and video. It refers to the set of processes applied to recorded material, montage, and inclusion of other visual or audio sources, subtitling, voiceovers, and special effects. In his text, he basically states that we exist in a world where all things have been produced, and that creation is basically recontextualizing or remixing these products according to our inspirational viewpoints. He goes on to posit that the artists working in this manner are using society as a catalog of forms. Bourriaud sees the DJ, web surfers, or even hackers as producers of art by their role of what he calls being a semionaut. He states that the DJ activates the history of music by copying and pasting together loops of sound, placing recorded products in relation with each other. His notion that the semionaut imagines the links, the likely relations between disparate sites, relates directly to a conference invention and the function of the data thief and my own construction, which I call the CJ. In my work involving hip-hop culture as a method for producing visual expression, I have invented the cultural production agent called the CJ. The term is obviously signifying on the tradition of the disc jockey or DJ that is actively designating and situating and practicing the realm, but actively using a visual kind of a codification. So my CJ is kind of a proactive flaneur to a certain degree, who is very much a child of the built environment, but sees all things produced within that environment as being equal, and thus useful for production of new visual communications. So he remixes what he likes and sees, both metaphorically and formally. In Bourriaud's definition of post-production, he clearly states that the practice deals with recorded media. Therefore, it deals with things already created. It deals with history that has already been viewed. The additional aspects added later are part of the process. These additions add nuance, definition, and clarity. They can also change the meaning of the original footage and become something totally oppositional. These additional expressions can, in a very real sense, rewrite history. So I perceive Afrofuturism as rhetorical kind of construct as a critical post-production, and I situate its practices as critical because it appropriates production from the Western aesthetic ideologies regarding artistic creation and reassigns its usage in a fashion that's far more powerful and radical. It uses these juxtapositions to unpack and deconstruct the product of recorded history and its associated technologies. It actively engages this process to rewrite history, to reconceptualize a black past and therefore normalize the notion of possible black futures. It is through this lens I view Afrofuturist, that I view the Afrofuturist visual artist as a constant traveler in the wake of the future/past, or the future past. He or she can be called a data thief, a semionaut, or a CJ, but the end goal is to construct a future by digging through the recorded crates of antiquity and recreating a history that is empowering, equitable, and truly free of limitations. And Afrofuturist artistic expression is never created just to inform or entertain for the sake of an art. An Afrofuturist expression, in my opinion, is always rooted in subverting a future where Black people have no agency. It is a radical notion for a historically oppressed and disenfranchised people to see themselves as active participants in the future world. It is from this critical post-production framework that I construct some tenets that might be looked at as kind of a futuristic. I think it's really interesting, for instance, as Ronaldo stated, that these two Jewish gentlemen created the first Black superhero, Black Panther, right? But 4 months before the Black Panther Party became the Black Panther Party. So things of that nature that we try to kind of make more explicit in the pieces. You probably saw some of those juxtapositions as well. Someone stop talking. How about that? And thank you.
Okay, so the rest of the time is for any questions. Let me get some lights on. Okay. I guess I'm goodbye, Mom. Good to see you. Take care. Bye, Scott. Later. Okay, you in the back?
Yeah, first I just want to say I absolutely loved the art. It was fantastic. I'm a huge comic fan, huge Kirby fan, BlackMaybe, so all that stuff. The second thing, given the kind of artwork you do, which we're talking about with, the original sort of, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, blah, blah, blah. And I'm sure you're familiar with also the supposed association of the story of Moses with the creation of Jesus and that whole story. I'm curious, in doing something you call Black Kirby, I wonder if you have any opinions about this sort of transformation of the X-Men from supposedly being a narrative about African-American civil rights to now being this narrative about gay rights and homosexual and queer rights. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering do you think both of those things were just projection? Or do you think that it's a perfect appropriation of whatever art you can use to sort of make your point? I'm just curious.
Yeah. I think when I think a lot of those ideas around the X-Men have been retconned, there's retroactive continuity. So because those particular issues weren't necessarily why they created the X-Men, right? Right. Actually, they want to try to create a superpower like G-Men kind of thing, where it's like their superpower spies or something. That's kind of like where it came from. But I think that throughout the history of that particular series, that it has become a general narrative about otherness, about being an outsider, and therefore it can actually be a metaphorical statement about this notion of anybody who has been, treated in that way. So that could be gay or lesbian, or other, sexualities. That could be different. That could just be being a geek, as well. So this idea of being like vilified, it becomes that, I think. And I don't read it anymore. I don't read mainstream comics anymore, actually. There's too many damage. Well, it's just that there's a whole like subculture of African American underground comics that I actually curate and work with that I think are far more interesting as far as like telling stories that relate directly to people from in the diaspora.
Was there another question in the back?
Yes, we have a question from Twitter actually. The question is, can these ideas about Black love be extrapolated to other San Francisco pieces? Also thinking of Butler's deliberate Black love.
I'm sorry, I don't know what that last piece was. Could you repeat that again?
Thinking of Butler's deliberate love, I think she's referring back to Octavia Butler.
Oh, Octavia Butler. Yeah, definitely. I mean, the thing is, I've been doing some work on kind of the idea of the Black romance novel and seeing how that becomes taken up particularly and. I might have knocked Love Jones a little bit, but it's also part of a general way in which love and Blackness becomes a part of this kind of procreative fantasy that if you hold my hand will still survive. And I like the way that, you know, Medicine for Melancholy kind of baits you in that way, of where, you know, it's not a traditional romantic comedy, even though you, as you're watching it, there's a way in which we give ourselves over to the thought that perhaps it might be. And then by the close, though, I didn't get to talk about it, but it's very significant the way that things begin to shatter. And this is after Mika has constantly keeps bringing up the fact that Joe has this white boyfriend, a curator who's out of town. And finally he just, you know, he's basically circulated through this film with this too big to fail, too cool to break kind of shtick that suddenly just shatters out on the sidewalk, and he's just crying and screaming of, why the fuck do you have to date a white boy? And then from there the film just stops. And you begin to wonder, you know, what was part of my spectatorial investment in wanting this to turn into this, you know, this kind of black radiance moment that, you know, they don't really need, that of learning to distinguish between love and attachment. And what Mika wanted wasn't exactly, it wasn't even a healthy thing that we wanted to see. You know? I hope that kind of gets it. Oh, hi.
So I went to Sundance, and there's a early 20s African-American man who was featured at Sundance this year. He's described as a beta machine glitch creating meta writing artist. And basically his rap video is an augmented reality version of himself, which is basically, I can pull it out of my backpack and show it wherever I go. And when I interviewed him, so I met him face to face, he is his avatar, no one really knows his name. He showed up with, you know, his entourage, but this kid is huge. You know,
is it kind of in a Ramel Z kind of thing?
He only performs, he's a performer. He actually is a Cal Arts grad, so a visual arts student grad, but he is really seeing the internet as his canvas. And he's also really taken Avatar to another level. And so we had a discussion about actually technical stuff, because I know how to do that, but he really kind of only communicates and kind of lives in this world and has a different language that I've never really seen before. So when we talk about Web 3.0, this kid is it. So, and if you look at his videos and what he's talking about, the world in which he's talking about, is very, if we want to say something is post-black, this kid is it. And I think so, and, you know, oftentimes we say the future is here now, and I think what happens is, one of the things he said in the interview is when he was a Cal Arts student, as a visual arts student, he stopped painting because he kept having to want to paint about identity as a black man in society, and he didn't want to do that anymore. So he was looking for a way in which he could continue to explore his identity, but where he felt he wanted to go, to recreate himself into something that didn't exist and something that had some power for him. And so he saw the internet as an opportunity to do that. So he inserts himself in interesting ways in the internet, in a sense that that's a stage, that's a platform, but he's also kind of sees the language of the code and kind of manipulates that to create his work and himself. So I think this is an interesting, you know, it's been only a couple of weeks, and the post that I wrote about his work went up, and it's blown up, and you can see how many, and I'm sure he had something to do with that, or Twitter or whatever had something to do with that, but it's a whole new world now. Even from when I was in Second Life, which happened, you know, 6 years ago, it's a whole new world now. And I just wanted to point that out. When we're talking about this idea of the black body, what does that look like, not just on the internet as an avatar, as a name, but also as a performance space.
Right.
What's it called? Young Jake, Y-U-N-G, Jake.
And thank you. Also, I just wanted to say real quick that in terms of, you know, these kind of iterations of Black Love, that if you haven't seen it yet, to really see it when it comes out. I believe it'll be circulating in April. Terrence Nance's An Oversimplification of Your Beauty, which is just exceptionally brilliant in the way it kind of offers these multiple formats about the idea of Black love, I think, and plus in such an experimental and satisfying way. It's a film, an oversimplification of her beauty. It started out as a short that he did at NYU. I think Jay-Z's distribution company, Valence, is going to be distributing it starting in April. And it's brilliant.
And both that and MJ are in the same arm of Sundance.
Oh.
New Frontier.
Perfect.
I just wanted to hear Ronaldo say more about Afrofuturism 2.0. Do you think it's a methodological shift or?
No, I'm thinking what's happening, I think over the last, I would say from between like '07 and now, a lot of the stuff out there, I see it maybe kind of coalescing into where it's looking at identifying the potential cosmology in terms of whether it's ontology and epistemology. And so I think that's where I can see it starting to coalesce into a philosophical expression beyond what a dozen years ago what was limited to primarily a literary critique or music. And now it's growing, and people are recognizing it now in different branches of the humanities. And I think that's going to probably clash with what we were talking about. You were talking about this idea of digital humanity in terms of kind of like getting us with this, they're trying to reproduce all this stuff in the 19th century for what they're calling a lot across the state now, this common core curriculum. So I can almost see Afrofuturism getting engaged in some of the, like revisiting the culture wars again later this decade, because I was listening to a member of the Obama administration who's going up for an appointment. He's saying what America is missing now is a common purpose. And I think the digital humanities is going to try and attempt to kind of impose that and to deal with this fragmentation of society. And I think it's going to probably fail. And so I think so there'll be a replay briefly, I think, for some of those things until they. I don't know what form of fashion they'll take in, but I definitely see Afrofuturism now in terms of really starting to come around a critical perspective, a philosophical perspective. And I don't know if it would belong, and I think engaging some of the ideas from people from the Frankfurt School, like in terms of how do we look at what Walter Benjamin was talking about with mechanical reproduction versus digital reproduction and appropriation, and some of the things related to Heidegger, what he's dealing with, and Adorno. And so I think it will engage with what the Frankfurt School is talking about, and I think it'll establish its own space. And I think as it's, and I'm very interested to see what they're doing in Africa with it, and in East Africa, and how there's different manifestations of it, depending on which region of the diaspora or in Africa how they're articulating it and appropriating the technology. So that's why I think we're kind of in that stage, and then I think maybe as here, and we're on the edges of, once that's solidified, swiftly moving into the 3.0 aspect in terms of how does that materialize over the next several years, probably.
I have a question for Dr. Beverly about, I'm curious about how you make the connection between Henrietta Lacks and this idea of the Black woman's body within the popular imagination. And one thing that kind of came to mind for me immediately was like the constructions of what you mean by immortality, because true enough, her cells are still here, but her family really hasn't benefited from it. There's like a huge, you gotta love Twitter, there's a huge tweet between Lisa Thompson and Rebecca Skloot that got really nasty because Lisa Thompson was asking her about, was it Lisa Thompson? I think it was Lisa Thompson. She was asking her about her fee, her honorarium for speaking about the book, which was on the upper ends of $25,000 to $50,000, and her family not getting any of that. So I'm very curious to hear your thoughts about what are the limitations to this idea of immortality, and how does that affect how we understand the Black woman's bodies as you presented it in your work?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. For me, the question of immortality, and maybe I'll try to take that last piece first with Skloot. Even in the book, she's pretty ambiguous about that question, and the fact that the family, tries in many ways to sort of get real answers to certain questions that they had, and she never really was able to give them a real answer about who benefited, why didn't you benefit, all of that. And I don't think, her argument would certainly be that, and she kind of makes in the book, that this question of consent was nebulous at the time. It wasn't really, and Johns Hopkins is unbelievable in terms of what has happened to Johns Hopkins, even today, what's going on in Baltimore. It's just been this unbelievably contentious relationship with Black people for a very long time. But I think she really tries to sort of make the case that this question of consent in that moment was not a question, that it was done commonly. And her family literally was, I'm going to try to answer your question in a very strange way. For me, this is all very metaphysical. I mean, her family is still really very connected to the idea of what she is, and connected in the sense that they know that what she has, whether it was cervical cancer or whatever, but it turned into a kind of intelligence that informs the world. And so what they're asking for is some connection to that. And so it's really no real way to answer that. Sloop isn't talking about it on this level. She's sort of laying out the history that she can cobble together. But for me, her family, they even talk about in the book how when her funeral happened, the sky was black, it was rainy, it was just an unbelievable weather day. And her daughter would always say stuff like, Gila is speaking and is talking. So that's the perspective that I'm coming from. That there isn't necessarily a material sort of immortality, but it is this question that there's this intelligence that lives in you, and it cannot be taken away. So that's a very sort of weird answer, but that's how I'm approaching it. So I'm not really, Sloop gives us a template and a map to sort of putting these pieces together, but there's certainly a huge divide between the way she looks at it and the way I approach the body and what its capacities are. Because those capacities are fighting to survive. And her daughter would always talk about how he was trying to survive, she's trying to speak, right? So that's how I'm approaching it. It really is in the sense of justice or tangible reward that this family is going to get. But that's how it's more a metaphysical approach that I have. And certainly they still, I think, sort of languished for years trying to make sense of all of this. But what we can get today, to me, is an embrace of this kind of intelligence. That's kind of my take on it.
Can I finish? I was thinking I was trying to answer a lot of where I see it going, because we didn't have, just because of the format, I'd like to have more time to talk about Chicano futurism and these other futurisms that are starting to emerge as these other people of color who've been impacted by technology, how they engage with it at this time. And I think I'm pretty excited. Her piece on that, and I think, so you're going to see other ways people of color are going to engage futurity. And I think,
can I just interject there? I mean, in terms of particularly thinking about Chicano futurism, what is the film? Is it Sleepworkers? Where in terms of this new Hispanic migrant labor, I mean, basically, it is.
Rossetto workers?
Yes, where they are basically put in a state of suspended animation to animate robots.
Sleep dealers.
Sleep dealers, yeah. But sorry.
yeah, because I think, I know for an interview for a book that's coming, I hope it doesn't get me in trouble with my boss, but I said, I think as an Afrofuturist, I don't necessarily believe in an American exceptionalism. I'm looking at beyond the idea of a nation state in terms of where my ideas should stop. I don't think my ideas should be contained within the borders of the country. I think I'm attracted to what other people got to say regardless of borders, and I'm not going to let my ideas be used to say, ooh, America's number one, because it might not be number one. In terms of questioning, I'm just attracted. Whoever has the best idea just has the best idea, and if it's in Japan or whatever, they should be recognized as such. And so I think that's why I'm glad, or I'm seeing this idea of futurism going beyond how it starts in North America.
But you can still, sorry.
No, go ahead.
You can still place the same lens, a similar lens, the way I place it on some of the stuff I do with indigenous. For example, the ancient Mimbres cultures, pottery, they actually have symbols that point to astrology, that point to, ancient, and these people disappeared. But for young people that don't know this stuff, that are indigenous, when they see this stuff, it really, really lights them up. And then they are now engaged on a futuristic level from their own, backyard. And I think, so it becomes a conversation that we can have on the same level. even
Oh,
though
of
it's
course.
their, you know,
No.
their artifacts, their culture, you know.
Of course, I mean, that's why with the indigenous, when I think of it as a potential pitfall, because you're always in the danger of having your ideas co-opted, and that's where it goes back to our Anna Hurley, when you think about what happened to Marinetti and some of the Italians, but it's different, but, what would some people in this work do in terms of, there's always that thing what happens in entertainment, people wanting to appropriate your work to service the idea of some nation state project. So that's always a pitfall. So that's why I was probably Afrofuturists probably, aren't interested in what they don't think about patriotism and that kind of stuff that much.
I have a question. I've actually never seen Medicine for Melancholy. Although that's friend about it, so now I'm supposed to see it, even though it seems kind of depressing based on what you told me. And now I really don't want
Depends
to see
on
it.
what kind of date you want to have.
But it got me to thinking about something, and I'm curious about this. You clearly had looked at a lot more films. The idea of especially when we think of Afrofuturism and immortality, the idea of sort of even the constraints of black love and black relationships in film. And it seems like even before this, even hearing about this movie, it seems like so many depictions of African American relationships are very much constrained to these particular cities and these particular places. They're not stories where this could happen anywhere. Love Jones is very much about that city. It's very much about Chicago. Love, Sex, and Eating the Bones is very much Toronto. These places are there. I mean, even Love and Basketball is very LA. These stories are very much constrained to these cities. It's not a love affair that could have happened in St. Louis, or could have happened in Richmond, or could have happened in Seattle. And so I'm wondering, just could you speak to that? Do you think that's just sort of a larger issue and how we're depicted, or is it random?
Well, first off, when Jenkins' motivation, other than being really inspired by Claire Denis' Friday Night, was to put together an independent project to prove that he was a filmmaker. He had graduated as an MFA, not University of Florida, I can't remember which school, but it was going through this kind of long lull of, oh my God, am I a filmmaker or not? So he writes a screenplay, and he had decided that he wanted to do this kind of romance. He's clearly, in terms of his writing, more sympathetic to Mika. And his idea was that the film could either be shot in Brooklyn, Chicago, Atlanta, or San Francisco. Now, I've always been intrigued by the thought of what if Medicine Melancholy was set in Atlanta, and for me it would always be kind of a pre-Olympics, post-Olympics kind of anxiety. But it's interesting because when he got to San Francisco, that's when he discovered, in terms of the research, where he discovered, I can't do this anyplace else. Now, the thing about in terms of what I think is interesting about Medicine for Melancholy is that it kind of refuses to go down the road that all of those other films that you've mentioned. I mean, in the sense that when I mentioned how Mika kind of shatters on the sidewalk that night, Joe's whole shtick is, how does she put it? Why are you doing this? Why do you want, what do you want from me? You think just because I'm black and you're black that we should just be together? We're just one, right? We redacted, I didn't even know you. I've been spending the last 24 hours cheating on my boyfriend, you're crazy. And then that's where, I mean, the sense that that's really, because the thing you discover at that point in the film is that, yeah, I've been watching two black people on the screen that I just assumed needed to be together. And I think that that kind of teaches us about, and in that way it's kind of a really reflexive moment of, what do we desire from these kind of visual enactments around history and around blackness, of our own kind of sense that, as I kind of jokingly said before, if you hold my hand, we'll survive together. And maybe that doesn't need to be the case. Or maybe we need to rethink, as I'm trying to do through this film, the difference between love and attachment.
Okay, just make sure nobody's behind me. No, I'm struggling with that because I love Medicine for Melancholy.
I love it too.
Right?
I love it too. Yeah.
And what you're saying about it, I feel, and I love, Love Jones' probably one of my favorite top 5 films, and that's
Yeah.
it probably, which is something, but I don't mind. I really do, but I say the same thing about Love Jones, you know, after people pick up the rocks and throw stones at me, then they say, well, maybe because, you know, the same kinds of complications, albeit they're not racial, but the same kinds of romantic complications are in Love Jones as they are in Medicine for Melancholy. And you don't know if you want them to end up together at certain points in it because of those types of complications. But I think my motivation for when I'm looking at, you know, the relationship in Medicine for Melancholy is I look at the relationship she has with the white guy and the way that, you know, he's not absent, I mean, he's not present in the film, but when they show the apartment, there's nothing on the wall. She's this art
Which is great when he draws a picture and just sticks it on the wall.
and puts it there. And it's like, there's an emptiness in that relationship, not necessarily because he's white, I don't assume that, but there's an emptiness there that you look at their dynamic and her ability to push past what seems to be her comfort zone, and you desire her to be with him not because he's black, but because there's a connection that they're making that seems to be lacking in what they're portraying as that relationship. And so then my motivation for wanting to see if this is going to grow into something is not based on the racial aspect so much as it's based on like their shared desire to explore something beyond, you know, this very white walled apartment that she's coming out of.
I mean, exactly. I mean, and I like what you're saying because this is part of, you know, every time I watch the film, you know, it's like the kind of conversations you have with yourself about love and our expectations from it, and particularly in terms of this mode of seemingly romantic comedy. And in terms of this issue about black love, I mean, that's more of just my reading of when you string together all of these kind of scenes of instruction of basically Mika strangely, perhaps unconsciously, you know, training her to be his African queen. And I mean, that, like, it's kind of a cute way of putting it. I'm just like, you know, but that it's weird. It's just weird that, I mean, why do we have these random scenes of like, I need to teach you how to be black, you know?
I'm coming at this as a queer woman who doesn't necessarily have the same investment in that particular black love story. So when I think about movies with queer women of color, I think it's almost too much to hope for that black love. Like,
what about in Pariah, though?
But see, in Pariah, I knew they weren't going to end up together. Like the tragedy of that failed scene was like, that was the expectation. It wasn't something that I hoped for. Do you know what I mean? And also because the other character was explicitly kind of not sure, right? Like
she was a floater.
So that experience, I just wonder what that does, right? If we think about Watermelon Woman, or we think about some of these other films where the expectation of black love is different because of queerness.
I'm thinking of the body of a poet, the Audre Lorde short, that to me, kind of in terms of thinking about it in a queer context, is quite powerful in terms of how you have this kind of meditation on Audre Lorde, which is very much driven around a politics and a political erotics of love. In terms of most recently, in terms of thinking in a recent context, nothing's immediately coming to mind. But I do. You're right that there are that, you know, I don't want this to come across as that it's just kind of a general statement about black love across the board. I mean, I'm clearly just kind of invested in this kind of thing that's at play here. And also how loving and saving and surviving in San Francisco through an attachment to Joe. You know, that you will not only, it will save him, but it will save, it'll save what the city needs to him.
I don't know, a few ideas. I think Medicine for Melancholy does something that more room to speculate.
Yeah.
I mean, it
And
seems sad, but not
Yeah.
necessarily, because we don't know. I mean, it happens
Right.
one day, we don't know what might happen tomorrow.
Yeah, well, we see her ride off on the bike.
You see her right up, she might
Yeah.
call him later. She might call him later.
Yeah. She might be going to get some bagels. You never know.
She might call him later on, and there's something, I mean, Micah, the character Micah, he really wants something, but I think it's something for us to remember too, that Joe is very resistant from the very beginning. She's angry, she's actually angry at him.
Yeah.
It seems, for no good reason other than the fact that they woke up together.
Yeah.
She's really angry. And I think there are a lot of identity questions, a lot of room for exploration of that, about what the commitment to attachment should be.
Yeah.
There's some, Micah finds out about her through MySpace, actually. Like, we were talking about advertising.
Yeah, it dates itself a little.
He goes on the computer and says, oh, there she is, okay, her real name. And, you know,
Joanne Harwick.
Right.
How many Joanne Harwick?
Exactly. Yeah, so there's this sort of, I don't know, they go to the museum, they listen to, who's it? They listen to Equiano. Who do they listen to?
Olivia Equiano.
Right. You know, there's sort of this digging through the archives of blackness and what their rootedness could be. So, you know, I don't know much about the writer-director or how much he was really, you know, deliberately theorizing these things, but I think.
Oh no, I mean, this is just kind of my reading of you know, ultimately how this film ends up providing this opportunity to some really moment of intersectionality around.
Well, it does seem.
Why did he pick San Francisco to shoot that again?
Well, as I said initially, it was supposed to be one of several locations, but really, I think in terms of thinking about gentrification and urban diaspora, that San Francisco spoke most immediately to that question. And I think also something I didn't get to talk about was, you know, I also consider this issue of you know, some of the ways in which several readings of the films are somewhat disparaging in terms of thinking about it in terms of it being a hipster film. And so I kind of argue about the necessary distinctions that need to be made between what's a native son and what's a hipster. Because I mean, that moment when your everyday life becomes merchandised and you can't even afford to live the life that you always had, I mean, that's different than, you know, there's a difference between what's going on between the two.
Interesting, because I haven't been to the Bay Area, but I'm thinking, I'm interested in meeting a black woman. I'm thinking Oakland. I'm not even imagining that in San Francisco. I mean,
Isn't the filmmaker from San Francisco, or didn't he live there?
He did live there. Right. He did live there. But it's interesting that he still wrote the screenplay, considering that it could work.
Because I think San Francisco has just a particular story around gentrification that's
right.
really.
Well, yeah, I mean, it now has the smallest African American population of any major city in the country, and that's still shrinking away. But that's also, I mean, even when you think about the way that the Fillmore used to be the Harlem of the West, it became the Harlem of the West after the Japanese were sent to concentration camps. So there's a weird, no one's really innocent in terms of this shift.
Yeah, one thing I wanted to mention that Moya was talking about as far as the ability to even hope and have expectations when you watch certain films. And I think that goes to even these discussions we've had about futurism, the idea of when when you're an oppressed or a beat down or abused people, even the idea of dreaming about a future is really complicated because you're oftentimes just trying to think of maybe the next day or the next election or something else like that. And so what I also think is kind of interesting is, whether or not or how often we even get to hope that there's going to be a happy ending on any particular level. And there's a lot of it with how we see ourselves in film is we just hope we just don't die first. Or we just hope that it's not something embarrassing. I mean, I have this conversation all the time with my friends who say like Scandal, like yeah, we know, and she's the harlot, she's a side piece, but at least we just hope there's something. I mean, when you're sort of desperately locked out of this medium, which is so central to all of our lives and how we see ourselves, you end up lowering your expectations, you know, consistently. You're just happy to see something, you know, on celluloid. And again, having not seen the movie, it sounds similar to me. In some levels, this movie was, I think of like, I'm Through with White Girls or whatever.
Yes, it does.
Yeah, it sounds very similar to that, except in the end, rather than it being this sort of lecture about blackness, they both sort of just accept that they're perfectly fine in their own weirdness, and that's okay, you know.
I just want to clarify, I don't want to say that I have a sense that queer films, that because people don't end up together, and that's not my expectation of a bad thing. So what I love about Pariah is that she is okay. You know, like she gets to where she needs to go, and that ending of not being partnered is not necessarily like that's a mode of survival, and maybe that's something to look to, which I appreciate about where you're going.
Yeah, I mean, and also the thing about Pariah, that I mean, that it fits so well within this this coming of age idiom, and it's just seamless up until the moment when she meets with her mother, where, you know, because that kind of absence of reconciliation, I mean, it's a devastating scene to play out. Yes, we survive, but there are some things that we just don't carry with us beyond a point.
The energy from that, though, when he's talking about the film Through Dating White Girls, or Through Dating White Girls.
Yeah, it's like I'm Through with White Girls or something like that.
I mean, it's a brilliant, quirky, you know, alien, post-black, if you know, if you want to try to go there, film about uncharacteristic black love, I think, especially within film. But it reminds me of the 500 Days of Summer kind of film, where there isn't a happily ever after, and you know it from the beginning, but there's still an interaction that is still kind of beautiful and awkward and difficult. The same in Pariah, there's still a beautiful interaction, there's still growth. But, you know, ending up together in perfect attachment is not what happily ever after. Dancing to an electric side at the end with the wedding, you know, at the end of the film, that's not necessarily the end of happily ever after. You know, and I'm not mad with that. I want to shoot the shuffle and I want to do all that. And I love the idea that we're going to wrap it up with a beautiful ceremony and have people coming together as family, because that loving thing is often missing in a lot of our media. So here's an opportunity to display it. But let's not get it twisted. This is not the way happily ever after looks for everyone. And all kinds of connections.
Yeah.
Or even like the movie, the incredibly true story of Two Girls in Love. I mean, that doesn't end. It doesn't end in a good way. In a way, you're kind of happy, you know, with they're together until everything's going to hell, you know, which it will. But there are. I don't know. I guess in a way, to me, there's nothing wrong with the optimism, you know, of hoping that things work out. Or even if you're just having a discussion at the end of it, that's part of why we go to the movies. It's the fantasy aspect of it.
Well, it's a fantasy, but what's particular about what medicine, the way that Medicine for Melancholy kind of stages as fantasy, is that it's so deeply located in kind of a space and a history, and also, you know, I didn't really expect we'd spend this time talking about love, but I'll just stop because I do need to think a bit more about this. But it is this kind of sense of in classical cinema, there's a way in which the conceit of the love story of this push for coupling will, in the end, make people less strange. And I think that kind of push, that kind of compulsion that's happening in Medicine for Melancholy, it ultimately ends up, I read it as ultimately a dispute of that whole wish. Okay. That you know, in the sense that they will remain strange, you know, and that they will remain sort of unhinged black folk on the bay. We have a closing ceremony at 5:30, don't we? Okay, all right, thank you so much.